Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. Everybody get your dishes downstairs and everything. Good. I heard that. I did beans. At least there'll be one pot. Well, today is our third session out of 5 on the English Bible. We've got a handout coming around there, which is also online if you're in need of that. Just to place ourselves, first week we looked at the basic content of the Bible, what's in it, what's not, those kind of things. Now there's much up here. Last week, then, we looked at where the English Bible came from, some of the very earliest attempts at translation, which were quite sparse and in a language that we barely recognize, unless you're an English prof and study Old English. That brought us up to the very first translation into English. Anybody remember who did that? Not Tyndale. Yes, John Wycliffe and his helpers. Yes, the great penmanship that predated the printing press, which we're going to look at a little bit today. What we're going to look at today is English Bibles between Wycliffe and the King James. Wycliffe, 1382, the first King James in 1611. So that's over 200 years of English Bible translation. Can you name any English Bibles from that period between Wycliffe and the King James?
Gutenberg?
Okay, that was in Latin, Gutenberg's Bible. That was the very first Bible to be published.
What's the Puritans had?
The Puritans?
What about the Breaches?
The Pilgrims, yes. The Breaches Bible, also known as the Geneva Bible.
I read your list.
If you read my list. You can see at least some of them there. I didn't attempt to put everything on there, but very good. So here's a page out of a Wycliffe Bible, again 1382 into the 14th century. The big shift in Bible creation, if I could put it that way, came with the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg sometime around 1450. It's actually a little bit murky, the exact time at which he invented the printing press, and the very first things that came off of it. But we do know that the first printed book was a Bible, except it wasn't in English, it was in Latin. So we don't know exactly what his printing press looked like either. Whatever it was, it disappeared. This is an attempted recreation of his printing press. You can see it's a pretty large piece. It's kind of a fascinating process. Initially, you might think it would be slower than handwriting, but once they actually get the page set up and can start cranking pages through, it really does speed things up. It also, because of the speed at which a printing press could create pages, printed pages, it made it a lot cheaper to get a page of text. Books, therefore, became much less expensive and much more broadly available. It's hard for us to understand that because, well, we've about moved away from printed books. But you can go down to the used bookstore, the Salvation Army. I mean, there's all kinds of places where you just find loads and loads of used books that you can get for nothing. basically. Of course, we still have quite a booming business in printed books too. But it's difficult for us to imagine a time when every book was handwritten and the shift that would take place with the printed page. It changed everything in the world of literacy and books. And of course, particular interest to us is the way it changed the Bible. The printing press made use of a plate that had lines of text. Every letter that was inserted into this plate had to be poured of lead or some similar material, maybe a tin, in a little mold. The step before that would be creating the very first tiny piece of lettering that the mold could be made from, right? So a lot of engraving skills were required. Once you had your very first piece of typeface, and you can see a piece here, you could recreate, duplicate that many times over. And then those would be sorted into a large tray with little boxes. So you put all your A's in a box and all your B's and all your C's. So the typesetter can grab the one he needs to spell out a word. Right? I'm already getting tired. That sounds like a lot of work. Here's a picture of one of those trays with all the typeface in it. You might see something like this even today in a museum or an old print shop. Somebody that's set something like that up. This was the way printing was done for hundreds of years. In the last century, we shifted that. So here are boxes of pieces of type, and then the handheld piece you can see there into which they were placed to spell out lines of text. Now the guy that's doing the typesetting has to put stuff into his tray in reverse so that when it's pressed against the page, it's in the correct orientation. Can you imagine the difficulty of setting up an entire page of text in reverse, letter by letter, piece by piece? And a lot of this typeface is actually quite small. I wish I could actually hand you a piece to show you. That you can, even on your printed page, you can see how small and tightly spaced those would be. Can you read this? It's backwards.
And if any man the words to
It takes a little work, doesn't it? But you're getting it.
Did they ever, well, they started off just with individual letters. Did they ever put a word in one piece, like the word and or the word the, that was repeated all the time?
Now, of course, you can understand, okay, so did they ever put the pieces together like as a unit? Yes. Now, I'm more familiar with the old printed Greek texts than I am with all of the English stuff. There was a period for about 200 years when they printed Greek New Testaments, and somebody had the bright idea. The brilliance of a printing press is that all of your letters are individual, and let's see, you would have, 26 letters in the alphabet, plus a set of caps, numbers, punctuation. You might have different sizes, like for a title, but what are you looking at, 100 maybe 100 sorts that you need to use. Somebody came up with the bright idea of making printed Greek New Testaments look like a handwritten cursive text. And it does look really cool. It completely goes against the whole concept of a printing press. And in that case, they would sometimes make an entire word where the lines of the letters touch and run together. Sometimes it would be 2 or 3 letters. They call them ligatures, where they're connected. But some of those typefaces ended up being 600-700 pieces of different type. And you can imagine the difficulty then. Instead of a box of 100, you've got 6 boxes and 600 pieces of type from which to choose. So, yeah, and I'm sure something like that probably did happen at some point with English too. I'm not aware that it became so popular with English as it did with some of the Greek texts, but yeah, it's a fascinating. You can understand why he's going to grab the ampersand instead of A and D, right? So yeah, that's a great question. An old woodcut showing some guys working on a printing press. Usually a couple of guys working together, and if I just read you off the slide there, a duo like that can reach 14,000 hand movements per working day, printing around 3,600 pages in a day. Divide that by half, that's 800 pages per man. Can you imagine a scribe trying to hand write 800 pages? Now you begin to see why this is really cool, because they can do some amazing things. At least a 100-fold increase over copying by hand. And of course, that also significantly reduces the price of, if you want a New Testament, an Old Testament, a Bible, a book of any kind, much cheaper printed than hand copied. Did you guys hear that Nebraska's doing a Corona Bible? Yeah, they're asking people to handwrite sections. I think most of it's done already, and they're collecting it, I think, in Lincoln. I think the idea is, hey, you're all at home, got nothing to do, you can't go to work. Let's be ancient scribes and handwrite the Bible. If you go online, you can find it, Nebraska Corona Bible. That kind of interesting project.
They started that, but I hadn't heard any updates of it actually, where it was.
I think the New Testament's done, and most of the Old Testament is done. So they're hoping to bind this thing eventually and put it on display or something. Let's see. Here's a shot. I realize that's a little bit small, but the Gutenberg Bible. And this is the first printed book ever made. I just realized past, there's also the issue then, after you've printed all this, of collating it and binding it. So you make 100 sheets of Matthew chapter 1, set them on a side in a pile, make 100 copies of Matthew chapter 2. At some point, you're going to have to come back and put all that together into books. So that's part of the process too. Just another picture of the Gutenberg Bible. Not every page is illustrated like this. This is an extra fancy page. And the illustration, the vining and stuff around the side, you can see is in color, and that is added by hand. That's not printed on there as we would do today. So they still took pains to try and dress it up and make it look beautiful. So that was Gutenberg's Latin Bible, about 1450, 1456. The very first English printed Bible was Tyndale's. His New Testament came out in 1526. Keep in mind then, this is, trying to do math in my head here, not quite, but close to 150 years after Wycliffe's Bible, his handwritten Bible. So for that 150 years, we did have an English Bible, but it was only in hand copies and nothing printed. And there was a fair bit of time, 75 years, from the invention of the printing press to the time when the first English Bible was printed. That's a couple of generations of people, right? We had the printing press.
I tell my kids Gutenberg wasn't English, so he wouldn't have done it.
Yeah. And of course, Latin was the language of the Roman Catholic Church. It was for liturgical stuff, for their Bible. Tyndale only did a New Testament. You actually have a copy of this on your handout. It's considered Middle English, not modern English, and yet it's legible. The spelling is kind of strange, but in the beginning was that Word, and that Word was with God, and God was that Word. Sounds like something I can understand, even if it's not quite the way I speak today. Sounds fairly similar, actually, to the King James. When that came along. His Greek text here, I'm kind of skipping over this. Well, you can see, I guess, on your handout, you've got a little timeline up the top. One side is English and the other side is Greek, printed texts. And you can see that the first Greek printed text by Erasmus predates Tyndale's work. Right? So Erasmus threw together a Greek printed New Testament, and that then was used, at least in part, by Tyndale to do his English translation. It's the first English New Testament that is based off the Greek, whereas Wycliffe's, back in the 14th century, was just a translation of Latin. As you can imagine, while some people really welcomed this, those in authority did not. And there was quite a bit of opposition. Tyndale's New Testament, we think they printed about 18,000 copies of it. And of those, do you want to guess how many we still have today? 900? Close. I'll give you a clue. You can count them on one hand. 4. So the campaign to erase them was pretty effective. And these are quite rare. It's a little bit fun because you can actually get reprints, modern reprints of this kind of thing if you're into that. But actual, legitimate, authentic ones, we only have 4 that survived.
What year was that? That was printed?
Did he print? He made a couple of print runs. 1526 was the earliest. He did a couple other print runs in 1534 and 1535.
How many did they make again?
18,000 estimated.
Was he the one that said something about he wanted the plowboys to know as much as the preacher or something?
Yeah.
To that effect?
Yeah, isn't that cool?
Wasn't he killed for it?
Yes. Yeah. He was strangled and burned at the stake in 1536. So right after the third printing. And he was about halfway through translating the Old Testament when he died. So he hadn't given up. He was still working.
Did he say something on the, when he was, like, open the eyes of, what was the last
I
word?
believe that was Tyndale too. Open the eyes of the King of England or something to that
Yeah.
effect. Yeah. You may not know the name Bruce Metzger. He's I believe he's passed away now. He's a Greek scholar who's done quite a bit of translation work and just a ton of work with the Greek New Testament. But he remarks that 80% of the English New Testament that we have, or at least through the middle of the 20th century, is based on Tyndale's work, Tyndale's translation. And that's a pretty significant influence for a book that was first printed back in the middle of the 16th century. For 80% of our modern language of the Bible to be based on that is pretty significant. So it had quite the impact. Out of the book Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, I could play around reading this stuff all day long. I'd probably bore you guys to tears. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David. There's all kinds of little things in there that who was the son also of Abraham. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. Do you notice something that's missing here that you have in your Bible?
Verse numbers.
Verse numbers. Yeah. There's no verse numbers.
When did they start those?
They started those in 1550. They first appeared in a Greek New Testament. There's some funny stories about how that may have come to be, because some of those verse marks are a bit odd. Yeah, so it was not for another century. So basically, much of what we'll look at today has no verse numbers, because they had not yet been invented.
So they didn't have chapter numbers either.
Chapters go back a little further. Those are actually, they were, do I want to use the word added in? Even some of our very earliest Greek manuscripts have breaks in the text where there's kind of a thought break. And eventually, scribes got paid when they were copying for what they referred to as a stick. And so they would divide it up into stick sections. They're not paragraphs, but they're almost kind of like chapters. Of course, our chapters vary a lot in how long they are. So there's that has much deeper roots, the chapter stuff, than the verse numbers.
Well, then what about why did they split up like Samuel 1 and 2?
Yeah, why did they split up?
Yeah,
Samuel
so,
1
I
and
mean,
2?
it always seemed to me like, why did, why did they break it there?
Yeah.
Or how, has that always been the case?
For Old Testament stuff like that, those breaks may actually be related to scroll length. Because a scroll that contained both 1st and 2nd Samuel would be really big. There's also a very long tradition that 1st and 2nd Samuel, from a narrative perspective, it flows right into 1st and 2nd Kings. And those are often referred to as 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings.
I didn't know that.
And that almost has to be because of scroll length, which is overcome in a book. You can get a lot more chapters and books, if you will, into a codex than you can into a scroll, and much easier to access too. How'd you get me off on that? Bunny trail. Thanks, Brett. That was a good question. The first complete English Bible, Old and New Testaments, was done by Miles Coverdale. He published that in 1534, and you can see a page of that here out of the Old Testament, the Book of Kings. There's a section out of his New Testament. It's thought that, so that's 1535. 1537, we have Matthew's Bible, printed by Tyndale's friend John Rogers, we think. So this is a very active period. 1535 for the last edition of Tyndale, 37 for the Matthew's Bible, 1539 for the Great Bible. Get my slides in order here. Here's the Matthew's Bible. Many of these were reprinted over time. This is actually a 1551 printing. Very similar to Tyndale's work. This probably is not large enough for you to read from where you're sitting, but you can see in here some paragraph type breaks. Those are not chapter breaks per se, but thought breaks or paragraph breaks. The Great Bible, printed in 1539, it was named that because of its large size. I didn't even get this out to show you. This is a one-to-one of a Tyndale Bible. So kind of a smaller printing, probably smaller than the Bible you carry, unless you're like my wife that carries a little mini Bible. There was a day when I could read the text, and anymore, even with glasses, I struggle. The Great Bible, 15 by 10. I have a little larger one here. Well, I'll wait on that just a moment. 8 editions of it. That one was actually funded by Henry VIII. So we have the state approving this Bible, called the Great Bible. And it was allowed to be used in churches. I don't have a photo of this one for you either, but these very large Bibles were often chained to a table in the church so that somebody wouldn't run off with it. Kind of an interesting thing. To come up. So this was the first, if you would, authorized version, authorized by the king, the state of England. This is the Bible appointed to the use of the churches. And another, maybe a little closer up, the Gospel of Luke.
And what year is this one?
1539 was the initial publication of it, and many of these were reprinted over time. 10 years later, 1549, we have a fellow by the name of Edmund Beck that issued an edition that combined Tyndale's work with the Matthew's Bible. What I'm showing you here on this slide is actually out of the notes at the bottom of the page for 1 Peter chapter 3. And what's underlined here is what gave this Bible its name. If she be not obedient and helpful unto him, that's the wife to the husband, endeavoreth to beat the fear of God into her head, that thereby she be made compelled to learn her duty and do it. Yeah. So ever since, this has been known as the wife beater Bible. Because of this dorky note at 1 Peter chapter 3. What else do you do with it? Nobody refers to it as the Edmund Beck Bible. It's the wife beater Bible. Okay, moving on. That was 1549. 1560, and we have the Geneva Bible. Became a very popular Bible. John mentioned earlier, this is the one brought over by the Pilgrims. Or you were trying to say that anyway, right? On the Mayflower to the U.S., this was their Bible. It wasn't sanctioned by the church, but became extremely popular, especially amongst Protestants. This did not go over well in the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, it was actually very anti-Catholic in its notes.
So it was the notes that made it different?
Yeah.
Like the Ryrie Study Bible?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is
The text
heavily
was the same.
heavily laden with notes.
Was the text a little bit different too?
Well, not significantly from what had come before. The text was essentially the same. There are a few places where one can twist it Catholic versus Protestant, but most of the text, I mean, it says what it says. Yeah, it's not typically the text itself that's an issue. There's sometimes a little bit of that, but not much. This Bible used Roman type for the first time rather than that heavy Gothic print that we've seen up to now. It was the first English Bible to use verse numbers. We had earlier a Greek Bible printed with verse numbers. That's what it originated. The supplied words were italicized for the first time. Depending on what version you carry, you may or may not have italicized words. I know the King James does, the American Standard does. NIV typically does not. I don't think the ESV does. But it's a very old tradition. Here in the middle of the 16th century. And it had a lot of marginal notes. So here's a page. Do I know where this is from? I think this is the book of Revelation. Out of the book of Revelation. You can see how much text there is compared to how much note there is. There's a lot of commentary in this Bible. I think I can actually read some of this for you. Get my pointer out here just for a second. So you can see now we have verse numbers. That's brand new. We have a note number here that will take us over to this note number 18. Maybe you can make out we have an italicized word, a word that's been supplied by the translators to make sense of the sentence. So those are all, and of course the text itself is not that heavy black print. But let me read this note for you. Namely, with that second beast, whom we called before a false prophet, which be ascending out of the earth, got unto himself all the authority and power of the first beast, and exercised the same before his face, as was said, chapter 14, 11 to 12. For when the political, sorry, the spelling's getting me here. When the political empire of the West began to bow downwards, there both arose those 10 kings, and the second beast took the opportunities offered to usurp unto himself all the power of the former beast. Those kings long ago, many has numbered and described to be 10, and a great part of the events plainly testify to the same in this our age. Just in case you were wondering what the kings at that 1 hour meant, there's your answer. Elsewhere, they specifically identify the Antichrist as the Pope. So you can understand why the Roman Catholic Church did not favor this version. Not because the text was anything weird, but because of the notes, the commentary. And there's a lot of commentary in this Bible.
Which Bible is that again?
Geneva.
Okay.
It's also sometimes called the Breaches Bible because in Genesis, when God made coverings for Adam and Eve after they sinned, this version refers to them, God made them breaches, which no other version before or after has done. So it's sometimes referred to as the Breaches Bible. King James would be another half a century later than this, but retains about 90% of its language, wording, and stuff. So it had an impact on that. Typesetting issues were always there. This is a 1609 Geneva Bible. Can you tell what the typo was? Then it said something scratched out to the 12. Will you also go away? What's written underneath it? Jesus. You know what got scratched out? It's Judas. Yeah. Typesetter put the wrong name in there. Yeah, oops. After you've got 12,000 of those pages sitting on the shelf ready to go. But innocent mistake and not too hard to do. Part of the page, the Epistle of Peter, general, the same thing as Catholic. And the Bishop's Bible. It's known as that because all the guys that worked on it either were bishops or later on became bishops. Revision of the Great Bible, and it's kind of uneven in quality. They threw in some maps, some genealogies, some pictures, an almanac, marginal notes. And the Bishop's Bible is the second one that was authorized by a state. So eventually it replaced the Great Bible.
It sounds like they're good size as far as thickness, if they have the maps and
A lot going on there. Yeah.
What did the French Calvinists, or the Huguenots, what do they use for Bibles?
I can't answer that question, Steve. To the best of my knowledge, there's not a lot of infighting version-wise within Protestantism. It tends to be more Protestant versus Catholic, but that's not an area of expertise for me either. So it's a great question. Were there differences between different theological groups?
When you say authorized by the state, what's entailed in that?
You don't get burned at the stake.
Yeah, you don't get burned.
The king says
And sometimes the state, this would be the Church of England, the king, would also subsidize the printing. But then you've got a statement in the front that says this is authorized for use in the church, and they always mean the Church of England by that. So yeah, it's legal, it's approved. You don't have to worry about getting in trouble for it if you're in that state, that country.
this would have been chained down too, so they
Yeah. And this one, the color on my printer was not real good, but This is a one-to-one size. Again, if I can compare that here to Tyndale's Bible, which was much smaller. So you can see it was a good-sized Bible. This is only a single sheet, but imagine that as a very thick volume, good-sized physically. Need a forklift to move it. Rabbit Trail. There was a Greek manuscript that was hand copied before the time of the printing press. They refer to it as sometimes as the Devil's Bible because it has a page with a devil drawn on it, part of the illustration. But it was, I don't have the exact dimensions off the top of my head, about this thick and like this. Hold that up so you can see. Great big. Now that I shouldn't bring it up if I can't tell you the numbers, but it was I think it's a couple hundred pounds in weight. Now it's a single edition. I mean, it wasn't printed. It was hand copied by one scribe, probably over most of his lifetime. But yeah, so there have been some very large. There have also been some minute little Bibles too, with pages about this big, and they tend to get kind of thick, and just tiny little handwriting in them. Kind of fun stuff. Okay. I need to wrap up here. The Roman Catholics did eventually, 1582, release an English New Testament, and then followed that with an English Old Testament. Guy by the name of Rhymes did the New Testament. A guy by the name of Douay did the Old Testament. And so even today it's often referred to as the Rhymes Douay or Douay Rhymes English version. Yeah, it's quite literal. Probably you would say excessively literal. I'm not going to bother reading that stuff to you. One of the effects of the printing press was a real shift in literacy. This chart shows illiteracy rates from 1500 to 1900 by men and women. And you can see it goes from almost nobody can read to almost everybody can read. And that's because of the printing press. Books, literature, written things became so much more easily accessible. We benefit from that even today. Our literate society is because of the printing press, and the thing that motivated the invention of the printing press was the Bible. A couple points to ponder here. Literacy, which I just mentioned, is due in large part to the invention of the printing press, and that has made a huge difference for us as a culture. I didn't spend too much time on this, but the English Bible has come to us at great cost. We talked a little bit about Tyndale, and he wasn't the only one to give his life for the printing of the Bible, especially in English. And then finally, the archaic nature of some of these versions is what spurred on the need to do further revision work. You can see some of that here. The Bishop's Bible is what became the base text for the King James, which is what we'll talk about next week. King James was the version for a couple hundred years. And so it had a significant impact on us, on the versions that we use today, on the church in general. So we'll look at that more next week. Any questions you're sitting on?
On that last graph,
Yes.
what happened in 1750? Did they have to kind of dumb down people to go fight a war?
Right? I can't explain that. There probably is an explanation. for those dips and stuff. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that it started to go back up the other way in the last century, but that's a little tongue-in-cheek. I'm just always amazed at people that aren't literate.
They wouldn't have had anything to read in the 1500s because
Yeah.
they didn't have books.
Yeah.
They couldn't afford to go to school. They didn't know Latin. They didn't have books.
Yeah.
Who would-
Typically, unless you were in high government or in religion, you were illiterate. And happy. No need to be able to read.
Father was a shoemaker, you could be a shoemaker.
There was no Google. Okay. Let me close in prayer. Lord, thank you for your word. As we see it coming down to us in various stages, we're grateful for those who have worked so hard and that allow us to reap the benefit. It's a great responsibility, and I pray that we would be faithful in making use of your word now that it is so easily accessible to us. Help us to be diligent in reading it and studying it, and with the end goal, of course, being obedient to